The surprise German invasion on June 22, 1941, was more than a military setback. It was a profound national shock. That single event instantly vaporized the carefree world of young men like Vasily Krysov. The immediate, desperate need for personnel meant that immense training programs were brutally compressed. Cadets, ranging from seasoned engineers to aspiring actors, were ripped from their civilian lives. They were thrust into crash courses designed less for competence and more for immediate sacrifice. Krysov recalled the terrifying realization that his intense training at Chelyabinsk was built entirely on improvisation. Driving instruction relied on clumsy tractors. Gunnery practice used Degtyarev machine guns instead of live rounds. This reliance on makeshift solutions and inadequate preparation implicitly shattered any myth of Soviet invincibility. It highlighted the initial shock and systemic disarray that defined the first year of the war. By the summer of 1942, the Red Army was fighting for its very life. The German drive toward the Volga threatened to sever the entire southern front. This forced the creation of ad hoc fighting forces. One such force was the 1st Tank Army under Major General Moskalenko. For Krysov, the journey to the front lines was a visceral introduction to the war's true price. Panic was endemic among the troops. Severe food shortages forced soldiers to barter desperately or subsist on meager rations. They ate sunflower seeds or grain scavenged from a burning elevator. The air itself became a grim, heavy testament to the carnage. It was thick with the metallic reek of blood and the sickening, pervasive stench of rotting corpses. The climax of this desperate defense occurred hundreds of miles east, near Stalingrad. Field Marshal von Manstein launched Army Group Dom, spearheading the relief of the encircled German 6th Army. The Soviets faced a potential catastrophic breach. Hoth's reinforced 4th Panzer Army drove over 40 kilometers in a single day. They were closing rapidly on the Mishkova River. The fate of the entire Eastern Front rested on a thin, brittle line. This line was held by the Soviet 51st Army, a collection of weaker units. It was bolstered by the 4th Mechanized Corps under General Volsky. The ensuing engagement near the Aksay River became a crucial delaying action. Soviet forces suffered immense losses despite facing superior German equipment. Volsky's corps alone lost 15 of its 30 armored vehicles. Yet, the forces held fast. In one desperate tank raid, they managed to destroy 32 enemy tanks. This fierce 6-day stand was a strategic tourniquet for the Red Army. It was here, in the freezing mud and relentless fire, that the Red Army's nascent resilience became manifest. By halting Hoth's relief attempt just short of its objective, the Soviet forces secured the Stalingrad encirclement. This was a victory achieved not by technological dominance, but by tactical regrouping and coordinated efforts. It was secured by the sheer, brutal determination of individual crews. The subsequent destruction of the German 6th Army permanently shifted the strategic initiate. It marked the moment when the momentum of the war began, irrevocably to favor the Soviets. Even as the immense Soviet victory at Stalingrad secured the strategic future of the war, the fighting on the Eastern Front remained a grueling, attritional contest. The initial days of the German summer offensive at Kursk, launched in July 1943, hammered home the necessity of immediate, radical tactical adaptation. The sheer scale of the German armored assault, spearheaded by a new generation of heavy tanks, demanded that the Red Army fight with grim ingenuity. The successful repulse of German forces on July 5 offered a fleeting but vital morale booster. 8 enemy tanks and several armored vehicles were immobilized by concentrated fire that day. Yet the chaos of the front line meant that success was often coupled with devastating failure. In one instance, Soviet dive bombers, mistaking dummy self-propelled guns for real targets, obliterated their own meticulously constructed entrenchments. This was a stark reminder of the persistent challenges in intelligence and coordination. The pressure intensified on the night of July 6. Intelligence predicted a main German thrust at the Ponyrai sector. Krysov's regiment was hastily redeployed, arriving at 2300 hours. There was no time for rest. By dawn, the crews were engaged in a desperate, frantic race against the clock. They were digging out their emplacements. Each man moved no less than 40 cubic meters of hard, compact soil. The physical exhaustion was a dull, pervasive ache that preceded the coming storm. The morning of July 7th delivered the promised hell. The fighting compartment of the self-propelled gun became a terrifying, confined space. It was dark as night as enemy bombers and artillery turned the landscape into a cauldron. The ground shook violently. The air was thick with the smell of burning villages. Survival relied heavily on resourcefulness. The crews recognized the limitations of their own heavy Maxim machine guns. They began favoring captured German weaponry. The men learned quickly that the 7.92mm caliber MG-34 and MG-42 were lighter and faster. An experienced crew member, Emilian Ivanovich, had urged the capture of the weapons. Now Vasya Plaksin worked a captured MG, bantering under the barrage. The German attack at Ponary was overwhelming. It featured a wedge formation led by the near-impregnable Ferdinands. These behemoths were protected by 200mm of frontal armor. The battery was ordered to hold fire until the enemy reached 600 meters. Their target was the tracks, the only reliable weak point. Valery Korolev was assigned the right track, and Lesha Kuzin the left. The successful destruction of the lead vehicle, a monster halted in its tracks, was immediately followed by others. This action momentarily repulsed the initial advance. It was here that Lieutenant Petya Fomichev's crew achieved a critical, hard-won victory. Utilizing a deep ravine for concealment, Fomichev's self-propelled gun ambushed a Ferdinand. They hit its track and immobilized the behemoth. But even this success came at a cost. Fomichev's vehicle soon experienced technical difficulties. When it was hit and caught fire, his crew was overrun by submachine gunners. Adding to the terror were the German tankettes. These were black, squat, tracked units less than a meter high. They seemed maddeningly invulnerable to direct fire. They instilled a unique psychological fear in the crews. The men knew their own vehicles could be blown sky-high instantly. Only fragmentation shells or concentrated anti-aircraft fire could reliably stop these infernal things. The culmination of this desperate resilience was seen further south, near Glazunovka. It occurred during a massive combined arms assault. The objective was a fortified brick building, an anti-tank nest that had to be neutralized. The attack involved tanks, self-propelled guns, and the fearsome flame-throwing KV-1s. The ATO-41 automatic flamethrowers proved decisive, but the cost was immediate. A leading tank burst into flames. 2 self-propelled guns were knocked out. In the midst of this inferno, Vasya Porshnev, commander of the 4th Battery, executed a desperate, chaotic maneuver. It spoke volumes about the human will to survive and inflict damage. Porshnev deliberately rammed his self-propelled gun into a concealed German Hornisse tank destroyer. He immobilized it instantly. His vehicle then directly overran an enemy artillery piece before colliding violently with a tree. In that terrifying moment, facing the immediate threat of German gunners, the confrontation boiled down to the brutal question that defined the Eastern Front: Kato Kogo, who will destroy whom? The human cost was evident in the physical suffering. Crews battled oppressive heat inside the steel compartments. Sweat poured down their faces. They endured hours of agonizing thirst with empty canteens. The ground shook constantly. The vehicle bounced violently over shell holes. After the fighting, crews would engage in a half-hour ritual. They beat the thick dust from their gear. They washed their grubby faces with small, sparingly poured amounts of water. The successful defense at Kursk, sealed by these localized acts of bravery, permanently shattered the German capacity for large-scale offensive operations. It proved that Soviet resilience and adaptability could overcome technological superiority. It permanently secured the strategic initiative for the Red Army. The crimson-red sunset that finally ended the hellish day at Ponary signaled not just the close of a battle, but the irreversible shift in the war's momentum. Following the agonizing defense of the Kursk salient, the Red Army roared into its next phase. This was the deep offensive. Operation Kutuzov demanded not only courage, but an unprecedented logistical effort. It drove Soviet forces across shattered landscapes toward the Dnieper. The breakthrough was costly. The first victory at Posadka claimed 5 tanks and an assault gun. The advance quickly stalled, not by enemy fire, but by emptiness. The regiment was critically low on ammunition. It was here that the unsung heroes of the supply chain earned their desperate laurels. Boris Pushkov, driving a Lend-Lease Studebaker, and senior medic Valia Vorobieva braved enemy fire. They delivered the vital shells, enabling the advance to resume. Their courage underscored a grim reality. The entire war machine was only as strong as its weakest link. This could be a shell delivery truck or the meticulous, fearful maintenance of the vehicles themselves. Crews treated their assault guns like it was a new bride. They constantly cleaned and checked against the catastrophic possibility of a lily blooming, a premature shell explosion in the barrel. They did this even as they themselves endured the squalid conditions of dust, sweat, and lice. The momentum carried them forward, liberating hundreds of settlements. When Soviet armor rolled into Glukov by midday, the sense of ebullience was palpable. Locals threw flowers onto the tanks. But the next objective, Konotop, a vital rail junction, required audacity. To cross the Sime River, the Soviets employed a brazen strategic ruse. They fashioned German crosses for their tanks. The lead vehicle, masked by this audacious deception, successfully crossed. This enabled the capture of the city. However, the rapid advance came at a brutal cost. By mid-September, attrition had reduced Krysov's regiment to only 8 assault guns and 1 tank. The 95th Tank Brigade was barely functional with 15 operational vehicles. The sheer scarcity of functioning armor forced a radical shift. Day operations were reserved only for extreme necessity. The war became a fight conducted primarily under the cover of darkness. The climax of this push was the night massacre in Golenki. A reconnaissance mission revealed a concentration of roughly 32 enemy tanks and numerous vehicles scattered in the orchards. The regiment prepared for a surprise assault. The radio signal, Storm 333, triggered the attack. Tanks and self-propelled guns surged into the darkness. They ripped through the enemy concentration. It was chaos defined by streams of tracers and artillery fire. In the maelstrom, Krysov's crew had to evacuate a comrade from his burning vehicle. Shortly thereafter, Krysov's own Su-122 was destroyed. The darkness swallowed the carnage. It left behind a stark contrast. There were the neat, disciplined lines of the German military cemetery, and there were the anonymous Soviet common graves. In those graves, 20 or 30 men were buried together, their names lost to the expediency of war. By late September 1943, Krysov's refitted regiment received the new Su-85 self-propelled guns. These were built on the T-34 chassis. They boasted a higher muzzle velocity and greater firepower. They were quickly thrust into the most ambitious operation of the autumn, the drive for Kyiv. The liberation of the Ukrainian capital required not just massed firepower, but brilliant strategic deception. It was orchestrated by Marshal Rybalko's 3rd Guards Tank Army. To mislead German intelligence, forces were visibly redeployed north to the Lutej bridgehead. Meanwhile, tractors with burning lights were sent south. This created the false impression that the main thrust would originate elsewhere. The actual crossing of the Dnieper was a terrifying night ordeal. 30-ton ferries churned through the icy water. They endured heavy artillery and air attacks. The peril was immediate. One Cu-85 plunged into the churning depths. It required a desperate rescue operation by mechanics in the freezing river. The offensive began on the morning of November 3, 1943, with a massive artillery bombardment. The subsequent advance into Pushcha-Voditsa, led by the 4-5 40H self-propelled artillery regiment, was a nightmare of forest warfare. The Germans had extensively mined the forest tracks. This forced the Su-85s through dense coniferous woods where trees scraped violently against their armor. 3 Soviet vehicles were lost to landmines. As the short November day waned, the operation culminated in a spectacle of overwhelming force. It was the grand and astounding army-wide offensive. Headlights blazed. Sirens wailed. Engines roared as the entire 3rd Guards Tank Army launched its assault over a wide sector. This tidal wave of metal pushed through enemy defenses. It initiated a rapid pursuit that caught German rear services completely by surprise in Pilnik. This led to the crucial cutting of the Kiev-Zhytomyr railroad. The advance culminated in brutal, intense urban combat on the western outskirts of Kiev, particularly in Sviatoshino. The Luftwaffe bombed and strafed the area. German flak guns were turned horizontally to engage the Soviet armor. The fighting stalled in open ground. It was only when Katyusha rocket launchers and powerful airstrikes pulverized enemy lines that the tanks could lunge forward. Street fighting centered on heavily fortified brick buildings. These had to be systematically targeted and silenced by artillery before infantry could secure the area. The pursuit continued southwestward, leading to the capture of Kotovo. German forces fled, abandoning equipment. This moment of victory was intensely human. It included the liberation of several thousand Kiev civilians being driven west for slave labor. Emotional scenes of reunion were amplified by locals who immediately helped round up German stragglers. During a brief respite, a shared meal of captured German provisions and local Ukrainian borscht was interrupted. The alarm sounded for an approaching enemy column. Krysov's 3 Su-85s swiftly and aggressively overwhelmed the column. They destroyed artillery and armored half-tracks. But the war for Kyiv was far from over. The German High Command, desperate to reclaim the strategic ground, launched a massive counteroffensive. The regiment was ordered to Yastrebenka to counter the new thrust. The night of November 19th to 20th, 1943, saw Major Melnikov briefing Lieutenant Krysov on organizing an ambush. It was here, near Brusilov, that Krysov's unit faced the elite of the Wehrmacht. They were elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. They were supported by heavy Tiger tanks. The ambush near Kozhanka was skillful. The Su-85s evaded the main German column and cut into its tail end. Later, near Brusilov, 2 Su-85s faced a formidable assault by a large grouping of German armor. Despite being outnumbered and facing overwhelming technological superiority, these 2 self-propelled guns fought with desperate tenacity. They reportedly burned out 8 Tigers. This improbable defense prevented a potentially crucial German breakthrough towards Kiev. It was a victory carved out of tactical ingenuity and sheer desperate courage. The momentum of the war had shifted, but the cost of holding that momentum was paid daily. The front lines transitioned into the chaotic, freezing brutality of the Zhytomyr-Berdichev offensive. It demanded continuous adaptation in the face of the oncoming winter hell. The battles for the dominating heights in Ukraine had been won, but the cost was staggering. The engagement for Hill 1972 was devastating. Flawed planning, including the use of outdated maps, led to a catastrophic order. The unit advanced into a hidden swamp. 7 irreplaceable Su-85s and their crews drowned. The survivors were left in a cycle of immediate, gruesome necessity. They were forced to transition instantly from offensive fury to desperate defense and meticulous repair. Major Liebmann's order to restore combat readiness had to be executed directly from the firing positions.
The men worked in deep, hastily prepared dugouts.
Their nerves were stretched thin by the constant threat of German artillery. The psychological toll was immense. The men who had endured the hell of the rye field and the massacres in the marsh were now haunted by the ghosts of their comrades. They were buried anonymously in fraternal graves. Yet, the offensive momentum could not be lost. The strategic advance pushed Soviet forces across the western Bug River. This dramatic amphibious maneuver marked the first deep territorial penetration into Poland. The moral landscape of the war immediately darkened. Driving deep into the enemy rear, the self-propelled gun crews found themselves facing not just Wehrmacht soldiers but Soviet collaborators, the Vlasovites. These men were known to fight with a merciless brutality that transcended the standard rules of war. Captain Marchenko, the chief of reconnaissance, warned the men to expect no quarter. This grim reality forced a brutal, reciprocal approach from the Red Army. It created a profound ethical rift on the front lines. It was a conflict Krysov personally struggled with. He opposed the summary execution of prisoners even as the necessity for ruthlessness intensified. It was during this phase, while operating deep on the Kovel axis, that Krysov and his crew achieved a tactical victory born of instinct and desperation. A premonition, what Krysov called his sixth sense, alerted them to the presence of German vehicles where there should have been none. Acting instantly on this hunch, he ordered 2 self-propelled guns to launch a proactive ambush on the Luko-Brest highway. The 2 guns were his own, and Pavel Revutsky's. The 2 Su-85s, moving with terrifying speed, became battering rams of steel. Krysov ordered his driver, Yakov Petrovich Mikhailov, to turn left. Revutsky was to turn right. They smashed headlong into a 3-kilometer-long German motor vehicle column. They used the momentum of their 30-ton vehicles to overturn, crush and destroy everything in their path. The roar of the engines and the sickening crunch of metal filled the air. Krysov's gunlayer, Sergei, shouted triumphantly through the din. "Take that, you bloody Fritzes," Mikhailov, a highly skilled operator, urged. "Comrade Lieutenant, it's time to crush them." The engagement was a perfect, brutal success. Revutsky later reported destroying up to 100 vehicles in the initial engagement. This was followed by about 20 more in a subsequent pass. Krysov's personal combat record swelled, reflecting the sheer destructive power of their mobile ambush. The action demonstrated the terrifying effectiveness of small, determined armored units operating with tactical surprise, but the success, and the commensurate recognition, highlighted the deep fissures within the Soviet command structure. After the ambush, Krysov arrived at the Advanced Command Observation Post, 30 minutes ahead of schedule. The contrast between the life-and-death reality he had just left and the environment he found was jarring, almost insulting. The regimental command post was housed in a luxurious manor house. Krysov described it as a fortress. It was a place of blatant comfort and security, far removed from the dust, sweat, and terror of the front. This discovery fueled a profound sense of injustice and disillusionment. Colonel Kaladze, the division commander, recognized the victory. He declared, "Let's drink to your battle success. You've done a great job. Tell Major Libman that he must award all the crewmen with orders. One no lower than the Red Banner." Krysov knew that recognition often bowed to political expediency and personal favoritism. His indignation boiled over when he witnessed the deep-seated corruption firsthand. He clashed with Lieutenant Colonel Vasiliev, an illiterate and drunken political officer. The clash was over the case of Senior Sergeant Monin. Monin had been caught smoking and unloading bread just 800 meters from enemy lines. Vasiliev aggressively defended Monin, citing his status as a party secretary. He demanded his immediate release. Krysov, the officer on watch, refused, prioritizing basic military discipline over political privilege. He was later pressured to comply, but the incident cemented his belief that the system was rigged. Major Libman, the regiment commander residing in the opulent estate, seemed more concerned with career games. He inflated enemy loss reports, obscuring the true, devastating human cost of the war. He was less concerned with the well-being of the men who secured his comfort. Krysov's rage was so strong that he slammed the door at Libman's command post. It was a silent, defiant gesture against the moral compromise he saw infecting the high command. The brutal reality was that the men who survived the inferno often received their due only in death. His driver Yakov Petrovich Mikhailov, who would later be killed fighting for Pazlek despite his 4 combat orders, was one such man. Those directing the slaughter from the rear lived in relative luxury. They were protected by political loyalty rather than battlefield merit. The frontline soldier understood that bravery and effectiveness did not guarantee survival or reward. They only guaranteed more fighting. The advance into East Prussia was not merely a tactical maneuver. It was a profound psychological crossing. For Soviet soldiers, entering the homeland of the enemy was a moment of intense agitation and excitement. They had fought over thousands of kilometers of destroyed Russian earth. The moment was marked by the sight of a faded frontier marker. The war shifted from liberation to conquest, demanding immediate tactical adaptation. The 143 5th self-propelled artillery regiment underwent a major transformation. It converted from the reliable Su-85 tank destroyer to the T-34/85 medium tank. This transition was necessitated by the demands of urban warfare. The Su-85, with its lower profile, was excellent in ambush, but the T-34/85 offered the flexibility of a rotating turret. This was crucial for fighting in the tight, heavily fortified streets of German cities. Crews had to master new techniques for breaching dense fortifications. They quickly learned to neutralize enemy gun emplacements. They adapted to the tenacious house-to-house resistance that defined the final campaign. The path to Königsberg was paved with fortified towns. The regiment captured Staloponen, Gumbinen, and Insterburg. Each required brutal, close-quarters combat. The German defense was fanatical. This was particularly true in the heavily defended sector leading to the great fortress city. The struggle to punch through dense fortifications was agonizing. In one engagement for Tarau, the regiment lost 8 operational self-propelled guns in a single day. This was a devastating loss that required a month-long wait for replacements. By mid-March 1945, the refitted regiment, now bolstered with 21 tanks, arrived near Königsberg. The final assault on the city, a sprawling, heavily fortified objective, was a masterclass in coordinated violence. The strategic necessity was to bypass the main defences. This was achieved through an outflanking manoeuvre over the Inster River. The attack on the southern outskirts of Ponart, a critical suburb of Königsberg, began on April 5th. It followed a massive preparatory artillery barrage. The fighting devolved into a brutal slog. The walls of German pillboxes proved stubbornly resistant to tank and self-propelled gunfire. This forced Soviet forces to rely on specialized breaching methods and close-range assaults. During 3 days of grinding urban combat, the narrator's tank was outflanked and set ablaze. He narrowly escaped the burning vehicle under a hail of machine gun fire. He sustained a severe wound that he immediately concealed. He was determined to remain with his crew for the final push. The siege concluded on April 9th with the capitulation of the Königsberg garrison, but the victory was achieved against a backdrop of moral decay. The war's end did not sanitize the systemic flaws that had plagued the Red Army. The alcoholism among high-ranking commanders such as Kachev, who hoarded vodka while their men froze, persisted as a grim reality. More disturbingly, the moral compromise extended to leniency toward horrific crimes. An investigation into the rape of a 12-year-old German girl by 3 sergeants revealed the commander's shocking response. It was a mere 5-day arrest. Krysov, tasked with the investigation, felt the absurdity and injustice keenly. He likened the process to an impossible, absurd journey. It highlighted how political privilege often superseded basic morality and military justice. Furthermore, the integrity of the official victory narrative remained suspect. The narrator's own experience of claiming 8 tigers destroyed was a vital morale boost at the time. It was later found to lack corroboration in German records. This underscored the pervasive tendency to inflate battlefield successes for the sake of awards and promotions. It obscured the true immense cost of the war. The war officially ended on May 9, 1945. It was ushered in by a celebratory feast. Masha the cook's borscht and Fedor Yashmanov's spam dishes offered a brief, bittersweet moment of respite. But the transition to peacetime brought its own complex legacy. Touring the captured German countryside, the soldiers were struck by the stark visual disparity. There were the neat, clean, technologically advanced German farmsteads. They were complete with diesel engines and fine asphalt roads. These contrasted sharply with the chaotic, messy Soviet villages they had left behind. This observation, though strictly forbidden, spoke volumes about the war's underlying context. The most enduring legacy, however, was the trauma and the sacrifice. The names of the lost echoed in the silence of the post-war years. Pavel Revutsky survived to meet Krysov 20 years later. It was a poignant reminder of enduring camaraderie. But the best gunlayer, Valery Korolev, and crewmates like Vanya Gerasimov, Sasha Minin, and Nikolai Samoylov were gone. Their memories faded into the official history. Petya Fomichev, the platoon commander who had fought with such ruthlessness, received the Hero of the Soviet Union posthumously. It was an honor that felt too late. Vasily Krysov's survival, despite multiple severe wounds and the constant crushing pressure of combat, was a testament not to a heroic system, but to the resilience and sheer grit of the frontline soldiers. His memoir, written decades later, became his final necessary act. It was a visceral testament to the mud, the blood, and the complex, often morally compromised reality of the Eastern Front. It ensured that the immense personal cost of victory would never be forgotten. The frontline bombs, forged in the heat of the burning tanks and the terror of the ambush, remained the only pure thing salvaged from the hell of the war.